Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet, still wrapped in a pandemic and a heating planet. That aspect of the problems we face has gotten sort of the backseat a little bit, although the fires in California and other climate-related news have kept us focused on that as well. Today on Sustain What, our Friday show, we're going to focus on ads, the ad campaigns, the ad wars around climate change. And it's a really important arena that I've been immersed in for decades, some of it unknowingly. As a journalist at the New York Times and way before that in magazines, my content was surrounded by advertising of all kinds. You'll see in a second. I'm Andy Revkin, and I'm coming to you from the Earth Institute Initiative on communication and sustainability. Although I'm in my home in the Hudson Valley, which is Lenape territory before it was U.S. territory. I always appreciate that. And got some great guests today here to talk about a new approach to nudge Madison Avenue, essentially to see if they can go clean and drop fossil fuel accounts, put that brilliance that is abundant in the advertising public relations world to better use around issues like climate change. It's a noble effort and an important one. And I have a great panel here today. JaRel Clay, who's a digital director for HipHop Caucus, had been in the advertising industry before that. And he's now taken the pledge, as you'll learn in a second, the Clean Creatives Pledge. Duncan Meisel, who has roots at 350.org, one of the organizations that I can't believe is like 14 years old. Is that right, JaRel? We'll talk about that in a minute. Who now is running this campaign, the cleancreatives.org, and you'll learn more about his work. And I'm glad to see Renee Hobbs pop in from the Green Room from the University of Rhode Island, my home state. Renee is a professor of propaganda education, propaganda literacy in the Harrington School there. And Renee, it's great to have you back on the show.
Happy to be here.
So we're going to dive right into this. I want to show a couple of images that capture sort of a chronology of understanding and how this has evolved. Way back in the day, I'm very, sometimes I wave this kind of proudly, in 1988, before there was an intergovernmental panel on climate change, before there was a treaty, before most people were thinking about climate change, I wrote my first big cover story on global warming. It's like 5,000 words, everything you've been hearing ever since. And I wave it around, very proudly. It took me a while when I finally got another paper copy of it from eBay a few years back, I turned it over and I saw on the back is a tobacco ad. So we were selling climate concern and selling tobacco at the same time. And that sticks with me now all the time. It's like, oh, this is kind of murky terrain, right? How could we be doing that? And we weren't having, like newsroom conversations about should we, walk out or whatever. I don't think we were mostly thinking about it. I think sometimes we thought about it a little bit. So 1991, my first New York Times byline. I was really proud of this too. It was during the Gulf War, the first Gulf War, and the Kuwaiti oil wells were on fire. And I had this little thought experiment. I wrote it up 800 words, well, what if all the oil burned away? Would we give a hoot about the Middle East? And it got published. I was amazed. I had just written a book about the Amazon. And it took me years really to absorb that this was actually the facing part of the op-ed section was an ad by Mobil Oil, which is now part of ExxonMobil, telling the good story of the oil industry. And, the oil industry is not implicitly evil. It's serving a function. We all drive cars, and I live in an oil-heated house still in the Hudson Valley. It's hard to get gas, let alone get off the grid, get off the fossil grid. But boy, these lessons, are big ones for me in terms of how. And then there's a great book. There's a whole story behind how Mobil, the PR folks at Mobil, got that placement in the New York Times. They normalized buying space on the most important real estate in the information sphere. And then, so advertising, right back in the day in 2008, Al Gore, I wrote about this for the Times. He said, look, we're going to have a big campaign. We're going to raise $300 million and have an ad campaign. We're going to basically counter all that advertising with our own blitz of advertising around getting serious about global warming. And while I was writing that story, I reached out to a professor, sort of like Renee, a professor, marketing professor at University of Iowa, John Murray. And he said, both Coca-Cola and Pepsi, they spend like $1 billion each a year to move the needle, a few percent on Coke versus Pepsi. And you're talking about 300 million or whatever. He said, this is like a blip it's like a fleck on the back of a flea on the back of an elephant of the fossil driven economy. And that was a learning moment for me too. So here we are now with this new initiative. Again, we've got Duncan and JaRel. We can talk about it. It's a campaign that's grown out of the larger campaign to move the fossil industry to the backseat. And so maybe we'll start with JaRel, because you have roots in this industry, right? JaRel, could you just sort of tell us a little bit about yourself and how you became you? So it's got like a couple of quick beats to what you're doing now.
Yeah, of course. And thank you, Andrew, for having myself and Duncan on the show. Again, I'm JaRel Clay. I'm in the Piscataway territory. I'm also known as Washington, D.C. Currently the digital lead at HipHop Caucus. I met Duncan and Jamie Hennon and the team at Clean Creatives through my work at the caucus. My introduction into the ad industry, if you will, was as a graduate student at Georgetown University. They had a PR program, master's program there. And I was introduced to someone that worked for Edelman, which is a global PR firm with an office in DC. They represent a fair number of Fortune 500 companies, including a few accounts I staffed. I was hired there as an intern initially, and then ended up landing a full-time entry-level position 5 months later with what they used to call its energy and transportation practice. At the time, coming from humble beginnings and also coming from a place where we now call a sacrifice zone in Youngstown, Ohio, with the factories there, I didn't really consider the kind of work that I was handling for my clients. I was just happy to have a job in a period where we were all sort of graduating into a recession. But as an intern, I got a good grasp of the markets that Edelman's energy practice deemed critical. And they were markets similar to where I grew up. We pushed messages of, jobs and economic stability and what seemed like a nod to even energy efficiency and sustainability. And so I initially thought, that the team that I was working on would be beneficial to communities, again, like Youngstown, Ohio. But as I got more involved in the grassroots advocacy through my freelance work, I quickly learned that there was another side of the story that we as Edelman employees just couldn't tell if we wanted to get paid, right?
Right.
And so as communicators, I think our job, right, is to tell that story that serves the interests of our clients. And for the fossil fuels industry, one of their highest, if not the highest priority, is profit. Our team was pretty good at getting in front of the national story and ignoring or even dispelling narratives that did not serve the client. We never repeated the opposition's talking points, for instance. We just offered a different perspective for target audiences to consider. I should mention that as an entry-level associate, I didn't do any digital work for Edelman. My work included media relations, your typical pitching, op-ed writing, those kinds of tasks, as well as stakeholder engagement, which we'll get to later in the show.
So now this takes us to the pledge. We'll get back to your experience there too. But Duncan, tell us a little bit about your journey to where you are now, which I think came through 350. But so what's the goal here too? We'll get to that. And then Renee, I'd love to back up and look at this whole sense of propaganda, the big sphere.
Yeah, so my background is really in the grassroots climate organizing. I worked at 350 from about 2011 on starting with Keystone and through 2017, and in between there kind of trying to help launch the divestment campaign and work on the Paris Climate Agreement and things like that. And I think there was always this idea that every time we'd come up with a great idea, there'd be these really well-financed, well-run PR campaigns and ad campaigns would kind of spring up to oppose us. So I left 350 in 2017, and I recently reconnected with one of the co-founders, Jamie Henn, who had started a project called Fossil Free Media, which is a media shop for grassroots anti-fossil fuel campaigns. And I think the origin story for Clean Creatives is really last fall, as there was a flood of advertisement around the 2020 presidential election. And our initial thought was, let's just take one ad from the American Petroleum Institute and we'll figure out who made it, and we will just cause a little controversy around that. It was supposed to be sort of short term. But then two things happened. I live here in Austin, Texas, and I realized that at least through 2019, API's advertising firm was an Austin company, GSD&M. And I thought to myself, I was like, there is no way this company, which has Tamale Day and breakfast tacos for dinner and is in Austin, Texas, there's no way their employees are excited about working for API. And then as we were sort of considering this, Jamie actually came across a video for Philip Morris. And when I first saw it, when he shared it with me, I literally thought it was parody. It was so poorly done. It seemed like a joke to me. And it's like, there's no way this is persuading people. And so I think those two things together led us to the idea of Clean Creatives, which is to try and connect with leading advertising executives and professionals in the PR and communications industry, and get them to think about their role in this communication about climate change, communication about fossil fuels, and take a pledge to stop working with the companies and front groups and trade associations that are most responsible for promoting climate denial and climate inaction. And it's been really great. I mean, Andy, you said this really briefly, but the people I'm meeting in this industry who want to create change are so brilliant, and they are amazing communicators. And, I've been communicating about climate change for a decade now, and I'm learning stuff every single day from the people I talk to. So I really think this is a powerful opportunity, and it's a chance for people whose values, who want to bring their work in alignment with their values, and who have a chance to be more than just consumers. You don't just have to, reduce your plastic cup waste or something like that. It's really giving these really brilliant, amazing communicators an opportunity to do a lot more. And so far we have, as of today, 61 agencies that have taken the pledge, and about 145 individual creatives. I think that's just going to keep growing.
And the pledge basically is to, I had it on screen earlier, but what's the premise is you're basically building a culture of ethically driven choice of who you work with.
Yeah, the pledge is just to commit to stop or to decline any future work with fossil fuel clients, trade associations, or front groups. So no more oil majors, no more API, no more energy citizens, or these other weird front groups that pop up, and just declining future work with them. So it's a little complicated. There's people who do have contracts with these companies that are hard to get out of. So we're just sort of saying okay, no more from here. It's picking up nice steam, actually.
What's reminded me of there's been two approaches to industry generally. One is kind of casting them as the villain, and the other is, what can be done from within? In other words, we're not instantly stopping these mega industries. And of course, it isn't even just fossil fuels. It's all the companies that sell products that wouldn't exist without fossil fuels, Ford F-150s, et cetera. And I keep hearing that there's more pressure for companies to thinking more about they have to lure their employees to have the high quality employees. People like JaRel, they have to have a construct that pulls people in as opposed to repels them as well. So it's not just the consumer, for example, it's the culture within. Is that shifting? Maybe JaRel, from your standpoint, one more round from you on that end of it. Companies have to market to employees too, not just their customers.
That's exactly right. And if you talk to anyone within the industry, again, they'll think that because we're working on some sustainability work, that we're doing the right thing, and we're moving the client and the country really in the right direction, without any real acknowledgement of what that means for the other 90% of work that we're doing. And what I see is a cultural shift in the type of work that comes in, because everyone is now thinking about how we can, or how they, I should say, can meet certain standards set by regulation, and what that looks like. And now being at HipHop Caucus, it's been our role to essentially point out what is simply lip service and what can really bring about change, specifically solutions in communities of color and other marginalized communities across the nation.
I was going to ask you too, we didn't really get to a quick definition of HipHop Caucus. I think a lot of people hear that and not sure, is it a cultural thing? Is it a campaign? So maybe you could give a brief snapshot. The pitch line.
Of course. The 15-second snapshot of HipHop Caucus. Essentially, we're a nonprofit organization with offices in DC and LA. We focus on civil and human rights, climate justice, and voter mobilization through a few campaigns that we run throughout the year, not just on the election cycle, but to also keep folks accountable in Congress and other local elected officials on the policies that we want enacted for communities of color. A lot of that work lies in environmental justice, and we are working with a few partners right now to line up with some Earth Day events, but also bring time and attention to the Byhalia pipeline in Memphis, and doing everything that we can to make sure that is a thing of the past.
It's great work. And boy, it's been quite a year for the work you do this past 15 months. And, these issues go back generations, but it's never been quite what it is right now, including the importance of the media environment around the issues. Back in the day, it was 3 or 4 networks and everyone was tuned into the same radio shows or TV. And now you've got this landscape of media. We'll get into that a little bit in a minute. So Renee, speaking of this landscape of media, you did, it was so great to have you on the show the first time, because I think I said earlier to JaRel too, I grew up thinking of propaganda as a negative thing. It's just, selling somebody some horrible idea that leads to Nazism or the like. And you have this much more fundamental approach to this idea of propaganda, which is initiating social change through information. And it can be good or bad. When you think about this issue we've just been talking about, what comes to mind for you? And here's your new book is really cool. Mind Over Media, Propaganda Education for a Digital Age. In other words, what do we need to know as citizens or students? But you also have an unbelievable resource at that website, mindovermedia.us. I encourage anybody who wants to sort of learn more to go there. There's tons of tutorials and explanations. So what do you think, Renee?
We have a lot of climate change propaganda from the energy companies and from the activists on the website. I guess, what I first of all, I want to talk about the rise, the kind of why the Clean Creatives Project is so interesting at this particular moment in time, right? The ancient Greeks had this idea about propaganda and about effective communication more broadly. They recognized that there was a right time and a right place where a message delivered at the right moment would be far more impactful than one delivered at the wrong moment. That concept they called kairos, right? Getting the right message at the right time. And one of the reasons why I'm so intrigued with the Clean Creatives Project is that right now we are in the post-Trump era, right? And one of the unique features of this particular moment in time is we've just had 4 years of a very close look at the social consequences of self-interest. Not even disguised self-interest. I would just say self-interest, right? Mm-hmm. So when self-interest reigns, what happens? And we see the devastating results. Now, public relations, by its very definition, disguises self-interest, right? And that's why, from a public point of view, it's always the most mysterious of the persuasive genres, right? A public service announcement uses the structure of advertising to link the company to a set of warm and fuzzy feelings. So you watch that Chevron ad and you just feel so good about the company, right? It's just so wonderful. You're happy to have them in your community because it uses the tropes of advertising, link the product to the feelings. Everybody understands that in this culture. But most Americans have no good understanding of public relations. right? They do not understand how free media is coerced, co-opted, or cultivated to deliver the funders' message. They don't understand how fake grassroots groups are created. They don't understand this front organizations. And in my business, in the world of education, millions of science teachers have used the curriculum materials produced by the Heartland Institute, which denies that climate change is even a thing. So I actually think that at this moment, there's a curiosity about this hidden practice of public relations, this disguised form of self-interest that is operating in a kind of under the radar way. And I think that because it's unproductive to demonize such a huge industry, right? Where people's paychecks, like JaRel said, it's like, this is a job, right? It's a job, right? So it's very unproductive to demonize those folks. Better to appeal to their better angels. And I feel like the whole culture is sort of realizing the disaster that comes when we let self-interest drive public decision-making.
Interesting. So actually, I'd love to hear a reaction maybe from Duncan and then JaRel to that perspective. Is really pretty cool. It sounds like this is the right time. Actually, the one thing I'll interject is that I keep wondering if we can harness more of youth who are, we all hate to be fooled, right? But I wonder, I think kids hate to be fooled even more. And if you can harness that understanding that whether it's the climate issue or choose your issue to drive that curiosity, it feels like a great moment. But maybe it isn't. I don't know, because I still don't see it necessarily every day.
Your parallel to the smoking industry that you brought up at the beginning, Andrew, is really relevant, right? Because it was the Truth campaign, right, in the 1990s when with the Master Settlement Tobacco Agreement money, brilliant PR people said, well, let's pull back the curtain on the lies of the tobacco industry and let's have youth discover the truth behind those lies. That was actually pretty powerful in changing youth smoking behaviors. So maybe that same kind of youthful energy could be mobilized to pull back the curtain on the PR strategies being used by the fossil fuel industry.
So over to you guys again, Duncan. Here's an example, by the way, of what Exxon has. School of Exxon Mobil. And this is all by the algae biofuels. I'm just going to play that. I'm not going to play it with the sound. But so what are you thinking, Duncan?
Yeah, I was reflecting on all of 2020 recently, and I think my biggest lesson is that 75% of strategy is timing, and just like finding the moment is really as important as finding the message. And you can really tell that the fossil fuel industry is trying to adapt to a world where climate action is coming very rapidly. And if you go to the American Petroleum Institute website, you cannot find any of their press releases 2019 or prior. They've been memory holed, they've been disappeared. And they are adapting their message. And in a way, it's a new message. And in another way, it's a very old message. If you've Amy Westervelt, if you've listened to the Drilled podcast about the madmen of climate change, this is the same strategy that they have been pursuing for over 100 years, which is to say, no, we're part of the solution. We're ready to change. We're not like that old oil company or the old oil industry. We're the new oil industry. And this is what Rockefeller said in 1914 when he was given advice from the person who invented the press release after one of Rockefeller's companies killed a bunch of mine workers in Colorado. He said, just go there and listen to them and pledge to change and it'll all go away. And it did. And this is the same message that they have always said, which is we're ready to change. The American Petroleum Institute says that they want to adopt a price on carbon, which is their big announcement last week. They positioned it as this big sea change. It was you did that during the Obama administration. I remember, I was there. You said this before and then you didn't follow through. And also, this isn't the climate policy that's happening. You don't want it to happen at a level, even if it were to happen, that would be meaningful to your business interests. Like the positioning themselves as we're ready to change, we're ready to be part of the solution is always their strategy when they're on the ropes. That is the message. And it is never actually true. And so the moment it's just you thinking about timing and kind of where we are and what they're saying, this is always the strategy. And it was a very different one under the Trump administration where they openly embraced. It was like, yeah, thank you. Good for business. We're glad to be drilling on public lands, that kind of stuff. So anyways, it's just you see it happening, and I'll pass to JaRel.
Yeah, I think the only thing I'll add to that is to Andy's point, and I think Renee, as an educator, you can appreciate this, is that our access to information and children's access to information is so vastly different than when it was when, you know, the Truth Campaign was doing their work. And I think we can be twice as successful with that in a way that, you know, folks don't want to be lied to. I think of my 5-year-old son who's asking me questions and I'll say, I don't know. And he's like, well, let's ask Google, let's ask Alexa. And both of those entities will absolutely dismantle any campaign that a PR strategist would put on for the fossil fuels industry if, to Duncan's point, the timing is right.
Yeah. Well, you can see right here that it's an active effort you're going to have because the shape-shifting aspect of how the industry approaches this is relentless.
Yeah, and not only that, I think that point that you made at the beginning about the inequality between the budgets available to the activists and to the industry, right? And so that fundamental inequality does mean that activists generally have to use more outrageous strategies to break through the clutter, right? Which itself has some risks, right? So, but those inequalities are not gonna, they're not gonna go away, right?
Yeah, and I think to that point, you do tend to get creative with some of those strategies. You see how quickly, you know, a lot of these folks came together on Reddit and TikTok, even in the game stop example, where, you know, they're using tools that are free to them to create a moment that will spark change in some way in how we approach policy.
That's actually a really good example of my 23-year-old son. He got drawn into the GameStop wars as an advocate, as a champion of, not of the company, but of the right, or the power of youth, of the power of the individuals to take the tools that Wall Street had invented and use them against them. If there's even a remote chance of harnessing some of that capacity here, it feels like a really interesting moment too, to get back to that Kairos idea, I guess, Renee.
And I've had this discussion with some people who I've worked in the ad industry about, like, okay, so why is it important to say no? Why can't we just start running great campaigns for the Sierra Club or something like that? And I think that point is important to make, that there is so much clutter, there is so much disinformation about how the issue is even framed, like what the question is. So much of the success of the ad work that's been done for fossil fuels and other polluting industries is about putting it on the individual consumer, making it your problem rather than their problem. And that is the level at which that shifts the terrain into which you're playing on. And it would be great to have another $100 million ad campaign. There's some brilliant minds who would be really well adapted, who could use that money fantastically. But just the weight and impact of the existing legitimizing infrastructure that comes from advertising and PR behind fossil fuels is so powerful. I really think it's we will give that good $100 million a lot more room to work if we can cut off the bad stuff, is the way I look at it.
Yeah. One of the things that I find really appealing about the concept is the way it is really tapping into this anxiety that exists among people who work in the industry. It's sort of like, it's acknowledging that people don't like going to do jobs where they feel dirty or they feel like they're not on the right side of this issue. Like, that makes that's why people leave PR and come to academe, right? That's a typical cycle, right? And I do feel like you're giving them, it's like you're giving them a gift, Duncan, you know? It's a gift. Sign on to this thing and be baptized and be clean again, right? And get clean with this topic. So I do feel like it's a great opportunity. I do feel like it's tricky for companies who are notoriously secretive and devious, like Edelman, where they say one thing and they do something completely different. So I don't know how you deal with that.
And I want to bring in another part of the challenge, which is the media, the news media, where the ads run. Let me just show you Bob Brule. I'm sure you all know. He was at Drexel University. He's now emeritus visiting at Brown. He led me to a lot of the backstory of the history of advertising and the role of the media. And he was tweeting not long ago here something that I've noted and been concerned about. The New York Times, Washington Post, they all run these paid treatments that the line between this content and a story is pretty subtle. And it's just another sort of an end-runny aspect. So my question here is, you're talking to the ad agencies, but how much of this is like in the news media? I'll show you this example from the AP in a minute too, that was so jarring when I stumbled on it yesterday. So maybe Duncan, in the context of the campaign, is that a separate path, or is that related to what you're doing with Clean Creatives?
I think that's probably a separate path. I think there's a real role for media to kind of draw those lines, and just with the business models that are being adopted, even the lines between editorial and advertising are getting thinner, we'll say. The New York Times produces advertorial content. They have a shop that does that for their own
T-Brand studio. I know. It's a money machine.
There is that question. I just wanted to point out, the thing I've been thinking a lot about is how the API's message is like really scatterbrained right now. They have this, on the one hand, they're saying power past impossible, like we can do anything, technology, development, blah, blah, blah. And then the other ads they're running now are ones that say like oil's in everything, there's nothing you can do about it. And like, on the one hand, it's like power past impossible. And the other hand is, this is definitely impossible. And like, I just find it a little funny to see them trying to like square that circle. Anyways, that's beside the point.
So why do you think, you guys are professional communicators, JaRel, Duncan, Andrew, why are those mixed messages? That seems like that's PR 101 that you don't do that. Why is that happening?
Well, I just offer a hypothesis, which is there's no single media interface with people anymore, right? So that you can have plenty of messages and they're just like targeted to these channels where you have different audiences. Is that part of it? Back to you, Duncan and JaRel.
I would say that's part of it. It's also, when you're a trade association like the American Petroleum Institute, you have different interests to serve, right? And so even in your own membership, you have to create messaging that speaks to what will keep them a part of your shop. That's likely the key reason why they'll develop messages that kind of conflict. But they don't, what then happens with that is they are not, as a trade association, directly responsible for obtaining either of those outcomes. They're just speaking on behalf of the folks who are supposed to make it work. And so that's kind of how PR comes in and shows you a way to be persuasive without actually putting any muscle behind the message.
It's so interesting.
And it's very different than like trying to sell people something. I think the reason that we are focused on these industries and not say on GM or Ford or something like that is that the goal of all this advertising is not to sell you oil directly. The goal is to obstruct. The goal is to distract. And so it kind of doesn't matter what message hits or the fact that they're contradictory. They both sort of converge on the same point, which is we don't need to do anything. You don't need this. Like, we don't need the American Jobs Act. Like that's all they need to do is they need to stop. They don't need to sell. And I think it serves. I really appreciate JaRel's insight. It's actually not something I'd thought of before. But the other thing that's always on my mind is like their goal is just to be in the way, not to persuade you of anything in particular.
Well, I guess that's the key. You know, it's something journalism, at least when I was growing up as a journalist, we weren't taught marketing. We were taught we're pursuing a question. At least that was the way I approached it. So, and everything I've learned ever since, whether this is for teaching too, outcome-based learning. You know, it's what do you want to get out of this course, or what do you want to get? What's your actual goal? And if your goal is delay or confusion, that's a pretty low bar to in a world where we're still very fossilized. You know, 80% of global energy is still fossil fuel. So maintaining that stasis is a really pretty easy goal if you're a high-powered marketer. And I love again, here's the pledge again. Do you get a certain sense of who's signing on? Like what kinds of people or agencies? Are they distinct in some way?
You know, it's actually proceeding about how I had hoped, which is that we're starting to get a lot of people who focus on, you know, values-driven marketing, who really try and put social cause at the center of their marketing efforts. That's sort of the place that we're beginning, and I think that's natural. And I also think it's really important because that is the direction that a lot of big marketing consumer brands are focusing their energy. You know, JaRel and I have had this dialogue around this campaign from Tazo Tea, which is a Unilever brand. And the campaign they're running is called Tree Core, and they're planting trees in environmental justice communities that have high levels of pollution around them. That's Unilever. That's not HipHop Caucus. That's like one of the biggest consumer-facing brands on the planet. And they are really trying to integrate causes, environmental justice, addressing climate change into the center of their campaigns. And so I actually think it's great that like all these people who have expertise in that kind of work are signing on. And you know, the other thing just to say about that Tazo campaign, with the reason that I find it so striking is that that's an Edelman campaign. And Edelman is working on that Tazo campaign and planting trees in environmental justice communities, and then advocating for more pollution to come from those refineries when they work for their client, the American fuel and petrochemical manufacturers. Like what I think this is doing is like, we're really pointing out the places where there are like contradictions, where there are, I would call that a conflict of interest personally. But you know, I like the Tazo campaign. It's like they're working with like actual environmental justice organizations. They're committed to like real principles. They're communicating about this legacy of racism. I would just love to see them not work against their own work. Yeah, JaRel, I don't know if you have more thoughts on that one too.
No, we love the Tazo campaign. We've been promoting it since it came out. It's kind of disheartening that the folks who are working to push it are also working to push interests against us. But we definitely love the campaign.
So So when you talk to PR professionals about topics like that, they often adopt the stance that lawyers do. They say, I'll represent you if you pay me or if he pays me, and I don't see any contradiction there. What's your perspective on that? Is it that's ethical PR? Some people tell me.
Let me just interject one other thing that came to mind for me as you were describing that split at the agency. 2009, I wrote a page one story with Clifford Krauss about cutting leaks from natural gas facilities, who was doing it, how it was actually cheap or even profitable to do it. So these methane, the natural gas wasn't going into the atmosphere, it was actually staying in a pipeline. Theoretically, that should be something a company wants to do. And I went to New Mexico, and the company that was doing it well was BP, 2009. And there was a culture. It was so interesting. There was this culture of best practice in natural gas fields, in cutting emissions. And it came from John Brown, who was no longer there as CEO at the time, but who had built a culture around cutting leaks and emissions. And then 2010, BP oil spill in the Gulf showed that culture of not tolerating any emissions had definitely not transferred to the offshore oil part of BP. So within BP, you've got two different universes at that time. So that comes to mind again. I guess corporate culture, especially with the behemoth, whether it's an ad agency or an oil company, is not some automatic kind of thing that permeates the whole place. That's another part of it too, perhaps. But again, back to Duncan and JaRel on what Renee had said too. Any thoughts?
I mean, I have my thoughts, but go ahead.
I'll speak briefly to the conflict of interest piece. It's what's interesting about it is when you have, new work come to an agency, it's often the case that new work won't be disseminated through the entire firm. For instance, when we would run conflicts, that conflict would be run by the practice, but that conflict doesn't go cross practice unless there's a significant reason to suggest that we need to run conflicts that far. And so there's a likely scenario where you'll have a team in LA who's maybe more, conscious about environmental justice, and they are housed more in the social and community practice within a firm, not having any continuity at all, or any even coordination or communication with the team in Chicago working on the fossil fuel accounts. That happens more often than not. And I don't know that, I don't know that we're doing enough to address that piece of it. We as in creatives and ad and PR professionals. And it's more so driven by, it's more so driven by the profit of these companies that give them the money to do the work, as opposed to the work itself. If that makes sense.
And Duncan, any last thoughts before I'm going to show you one other example? I'm going to take you down one other notch down and toward the bottom, the dark side of the challenge, and then we'll focus on solutions going forward. But any more thoughts on this particular point?
Yeah, I spoke with someone who is, a mid-level just employee at a major ad agency that has a substantial fossil fuel client, and everybody knows it. Everybody understands they're one of the clients, but no one has ever seen anybody who works on it. And what he found out was actually that the people who worked on it were in a satellite office in a city where there's no one else from the agency who works there. And this is the other interesting dynamic around why I think it's so important that a bunch of smaller agencies and small individual creatives assign the pledge is a lot of this work is kind of filtered down and outsourced and pushed down to smaller creatives, because keeping it in shop isn't consistent with the company culture that agencies are trying to build. And so I think actually having a lot of smaller voices, smaller agencies and individuals say, we're not going to do this, is actually starting to cut off a source of talent and, just a way that the way that these companies handle these contracts. It is very often pushed down and out is my experience.
That's useful thinking too. Let me, hold on. I want to get back to something here. I lost here it is. Hold on. The technology is still not my friend. Hold on one more second. I've got a bit of a technical glitch happening. Renee, interject an idea. Let's hear more about your book while I fix this. What can people learn what's the role of the audience here ultimately?
I think what we need is something I might call like public relations literacy, right? Better understanding of public relations would be a benefit to the whole society, right? I try to help my students by helping them see if they can spot a news story that's been influenced by public relations, right? I try to help them recognize sponsored content wherever it's found. And like you said about the blurriness, I do feel like the challenges in the social media world and online, the blurry has become so normative that we can't muster. We used to be able to muster some outrage towards sponsored content, but we can't anymore because it's become so ubiquitous, right?
Right.
And I feel like in some ways it's partly because people go, so it's the point of view of the fossil fuel industry. Okay, right? Freedom of expression. They're entitled to their point of view. right? So there's a very much a kind of, what's the problem with sponsored content? And I feel like, the decline of journalism, the journalism PR equation is really out of whack. What do they say? There's 5 PR professionals for every 1 journalist. So that the implications of that are felt through all sectors of our society, and yet the public
horrifying.
Cannot actually even explain what public relations is. And something's wrong with that. So we need to have there needs to be an activist community within the public relations community that wants to pull back the curtain on its own industries and say, okay, be an informed consumer of public relations. I make my students read Eddie Bernays' 1928 propaganda. The guy's techniques are timeless and still used today, right? But it'd be cool to have the next generation of PR professionals help us bring it, not just to future PR workers. I get that. That's cool. But I mean, to people who are from all walks of life.
That's really neat. Maybe this gets to the point of what's the next step here. And one could be, I always try to think in the last 15, 20 minutes of the show to think about what could we do together that we can't do individually. And maybe there's some conjunction of folks like Renee and academia and folks like you guys driving this kind of campaign to have an education component as well. Is there one yet? Or is that could that be a next step?
We're actually doing a survey of PR and advertising professionals under 35 right now. We're actually doing a real poll, to get some data on just where people stand on this. And it'd be interesting to see the results. I think there's a really critical role for the pipeline of smart people that are coming up through academia and entering these agencies. I think there's a really important role for them to play. And one reflection as we're sort of developing this campaign was that the fossil fuel industry and the advertising PR industry are both extremely anxious about the next generation. They both have so many questions about what young Gen Z and younger people mean for their business models. And I think it gives young people in particular a vital role to play in demanding different and better. And I don't know. I just think that is the pivot point around which a lot of this will hinge.
I have to show something. Raleigh Williams is a young comedian who went to graduate school at Columbia. He's been wrapping up his master's in sustainability, science and policy. But he's also generating these. They're not huge yet, but he's done several YouTube videos he has Climate Town is his YouTube channel. And he's a pitch man. And let me just play a couple seconds here. This is him talking about it on an earlier show about the role of humor in driving climate progress.
Yeah. The premise of this one is a little different. This is about carbon offsets. So there's all these, big fossil companies and Amazon and Microsoft. Let me know if you can't hear it. And even Shell, these companies are saying, hey, we're going to solve climate change. We're finally taking.
Hold on. It'll catch up. Buffer. Oh, here we go.
Taking it seriously, and we're going to solve climate change by using carbon offset, which it turns. I nailed that timing actually. And it turns out carbon offsets cannot solve climate change. We built up a carbon debt. A carbon offset, even in the most effective way it's used, can only move the needle to not increasing our debt, but our debt is what's going to swamp developing countries, and it's being used as a smokescreen to sell more fossil fuels.
So what's cool about that is, again, it's the asymmetry in the landscape out there means that anyone who's creative, who's a climate creative, right, can just nail it and potentially really make a change. John Oliver, he actually, Raleigh did one on plastics, the fantasy of recycling, that has hundreds of thousands of views. It was on air, weeks, actually a couple of months before John Oliver and the Daily Show. I mean, this week last week tonight did that big thing on plastics. So is there an army that can be deployed here of creative young communicators around these issues as well? Renee, I don't know if do your students practice? Do they test drive propaganda? Is that part of what they do, or is it more about understanding propaganda?
Yeah, you have to create propaganda to really understand it, don't you?
Yeah, I wonder.
Yeah, you absolutely have to. And so I make my students create propaganda, and I make them choose from a short list of good causes, right? And so they get to practice. And of course, what they discover is that activating strong emotions and attacking opponents has risks. The nature of the business of creating propaganda is that you have to figure out the audience reaction, and you can never completely figure that out, right? So they actually often experiment and fail, and that failure is actually the best way to learn about the very powerful techniques that shape attention and influence behavior.
So back to you guys one more time on this question of next steps. So you have this campaign, you're signing up individuals within the industry, but I don't know if this feels like a possibility that we can generate a bit of a lesson plan or something around it too. That feels like it might be a next step, but where do you go from here?
I'd say three things I'll quickly add as I turn to Duncan, is that it's funny that you play that clip about comedy and climate change, because HipHop Caucus, along with a few other partners, just wrapped up a comedy special on the climate crisis that aired at the Environmental Film Festival in the nation's capital. It was a film with 4 Black comedians in the Norfolk, Virginia area, which we know is below sea level and rising pretty much every week. But they took to the stage to essentially make the climate crisis funny in front of, obviously, an audience that are at risk of being displaced from their homes.
Right.
And it helped them essentially understand what is at risk and what they could do about it. I would say in terms of climate literacy, and this is getting a little bit into, Renee's camp, is that for Earth Day, we're doing a summit in partnership with Earth Day Network, Education International, and Earth Uprising. And it's a 3-day summit that will focus on specific demands, not only for the Biden administration, but members of Congress as well. There is a segment there that focuses on climate literacy and how we can get more education, secondary education, focused on climate literacy. Piggybacking on that, HipHop Caucus is also in partnership with a few schools across the nation through the AVID program. That's Advancement via Individual Determination, and where we specifically talk to high school students about how they can get involved in climate activism as a career or as just a way of life in terms of how they operate and how they show up with elected officials. And the last thing I'll add there is, in addition to all that, Duncan and I have been on Clubhouse and other mediums, making sure that we try to get the message to folks, because when we think about effectiveness and solutions, we have to consider like 3 things. The message has to go to where the people reside. We need to elect officials who believe in science, and we have to reject the notion that like innovation and entrepreneurship come at the cost of our lives. We also know that, the fossil fuel industry, their business model as we speak, is a death sentence for a lot of these communities. And we have to challenge these companies to shift their business models away from fossil fuels.
Those are 3, those are really important tactics. And that's great to hear about the Environmental Film Festival. I had missed that. I try to keep up on everything, but I always fail. So it feels like something I could draw some more attention to for sure. And Duncan, just some last words from you too on next steps.
I just wanted to just before we get into Clean Creatives, just say the working with JaRel and HipHop Caucus on this project, I think one of the legacies of environmental racism that we're facing is that communities that have they're fence line communities that do have the pollution and the infrastructure in their backyards, they are also the target of propaganda more than anyone else too, because that is where the power lies. The power to stop these projects lies. And so I think HipHop Caucus's focus is so important for that reason as well, just because this is like the frontline community of the place where the misinformation goes, as well as the pollution. So the Clean Creatives, our next steps are, we want to keep talking to professionals. I spend most of my time on this project trying to speak with people who work at agencies, who have taken the pledge or think about taking the pledge, just to introduce the idea. And I think the basic thing is more is more. The more people talk about this, the more they bring it up, even just as a conversation. Even if you're not sure you're ready to take the pledge, just sort of asking the question really moves the needle, and I think offers a chance to reflect on the work that is being done. And we're going to continue to find ways to ask the questions. So we are going to ask ad award shows to sort of take their leadership role to heart and say that they should not accept submissions for advertisements made for fossil fuel clients. We're going to ask the leading agencies that do have these partnerships that we know of with fossil fuel companies to do better and continue to make, just ask really pointed questions. Because I think, going back to the Unilever example, it may be that that's ethical work. It may be that there's sort of business practices you could use to justify that, but you're not doing your best work for Unilever if you're working for the opponents of their actual, marketing strategy. Like working for the refineries in that example is making your job harder. You're making your client's job harder. And so just continuing to make that self-interested case about how this affects, your workforce, how this affects your best clients. I think that's where we're going to go next. And the last thing I'll say is that it's always really striking to me that the agencies that do take on these fossil fuel clients, they don't like to advertise it. They don't like to tell you that they're doing it. They're not proud of the work in the same way that they are proud of work that they've done for Tazo or something like that. So that's the point we're going to keep trying to make and just keep raising this conversation, because I think there is extraordinary power and creativity and influence in the minds and brilliant institutions that exist for the advertising world. And I'm just excited to see those be put to work for good.
Do you have a couple more minutes if we go just past the hour? There were some questions that came in I could run by you.
I do, yes, but I'm going to speak for myself.
Hold on. JP Isham out I think he's in the West Coast, says here, I've noticed investors focusing more on CSR, ESG, name your acronym, actions, and as mentioned, new job seekers are also more aligned with corporate values. How can we elevate the discussion with employers to help them understand the need to be conscious to attract the best talent? I think we kind of got at that a little bit, but is there some aspect of what you're doing now that is aimed there too?
Like I said, we are trying to just have a poll, like get some data on how many people really have this conversation. But a few weeks ago, BuzzFeed published an article about Edelman's work for American fuel and petrochemical manufacturers, and that immediately popped up on Fishbowl, which is an advertising agency, sort of anonymous message board. Like it bounced through. It was like right away, and that's where people go to talk about what work they're going to take next, and what companies they want to work for next. And so, that's a very small example, and I think maybe more will come. But I have to imagine that people thinking about their next job are thinking about this on some level or another.
Yeah, and even beyond the sort of how people are thinking about it from a point of view of their job, I think the industry has proven over and over the power of values-driven marketing. I mean, the success of femvertising, right, of taking a positive feminist stance toward issues and products and and harnessing that to link to brands and products, like it's actually good for the bottom line. So values-driven marketing has practical benefits for clients, and it's done well.
That's good to hear. There's Betsy Rosenberg offers one other point, which is that along with the public relations illiteracy, we still have basic eco literacy challenge too. Climate change is a tough one. It's not like a sewer pipe spewing something that is killing people. It's got this much bigger landscape. The time scale is really challenging. And so there's multiple challenges, I guess, here in terms of literacy, and whether it's the audience for media or it's even in classrooms all the way through from the lower grades up. There's work to be done. So I guess that means we are sort of at the end of our hour here. I think we've identified some really great next steps. I would love to help sustain a conversation on this topic. I have yet to have one of these Sustain What episodes that isn't the start of a conversation with directionality, not just yammering, but maybe we can focus in on that idea of the education interface here to get kids asking their parents if they're working in these fields to do more, or this idea of having people who've signed the pledge. Here's the last thought. Okay, there's this thing called Skype a Scientist, which I've done 2 shows on. It's basically a way for scientists to get into classrooms. So we can have Skype a clean creative, to get clean creatives in classrooms going forward. That would be something. I'll talk to Sarah McNulty at Skype a Scientist, and maybe we could talk about that too. So this has been a really good, rich beginning of a conversation on what climate campaigners can do to nudge at Madison Avenue to go clean and move away from fossil fuel accounts, and in a more general way to foster the message of possibility more than marketing inertia, there's been way too much of that. I would hate to think that someone will be picking up magazines or something else and have this kind of bifurcated messaging as well. So thanks to Duncan Meisel, to JaRel Clay, and Renee Hobbs. You're all welcome to come back on Earth Institute Sustain What webcast anytime. Let's keep this going forward. And I'll be here Sunday, Monday. Next week, we're doing an important set of sessions, Wednesday and Friday, on centering disaster risk work around children. The Wednesday session will be in Spanish, in Espanol, and focused on people in Puerto Rico. And the Friday one will be on North Carolina communities at risk. In that case, often Black communities at risk because of that historic landscape we've built that needs some unbuilding and rebuilding. So again, thanks to everyone for tuning in. You can share this 4 different ways as soon as we're done, and I'll send the links around. And audience questions can always come into me. You see that scrolling, distracting bar, selling connectivity down at the bottom. You can find ways to get in touch with ideas or feedback. So thanks again to all of you for being here today. And you can click off now, but I'm going to play a song by one of my favorite songwriters, T-Bone Burnett, called Madison Avenue, as like a going away present. But thanks again for being here, and hang around for that for a couple minutes if you want to hear it.
Thank you all.
Take care. And I'm going to set that up now because it's too cool. Share screen. Hold on. Chrome tab. T-Bone. Oops. It's worth it for anyone who's sticking around. Hold on. Here we go.
Will you tell me this riddle? Who is the father of lies? Who is the master of half-truth? What is Madison Avenue? It is everything you need to get closer. It is in search of an historic Jesus. It is expensive at 50% off. Will you tell me this riddle? Who is the father of lies? Who is the master of half-truth? What is Madison Avenue? It is a 50-foot-long bronze naked girl. It is a travel poster in a prison cell. riddle. Who is the father of lies? Who is the master of half-truth? What is Madison Avenue? It is a death cult that terrorized the town. It is a love affair that brought a nation down. It is a desperate desert battle to the death.
Thanks for tuning in. Take care. And tune in every Sunday also for our arts-focused sessions, including this Sunday. This is Andy Revkin, Earth Institute at Columbia University, from my home in the Hudson Valley, signing off. Have a good night, good day, good weekend.